Howdy, of you delicious people. So, I'm here today to review the second half of the first season of The Last Man on Earth, ultimately combing through episode 7 to episode 12. So, going into this show, immediately I feel that there are some interesting things going on in the first season, and I think in the second half, or in the first half of this season. In the second half, it just kind of goes into kind of making it so that like each person is kind of tied to otherwise the story, and so reasonably we have it to where we have characters that are otherwise tied to the story much more so than Phil right out of the gate. And I'm like, okay, that is kind of an odd way to approach going into and doing a show already when it feels like a lot of times you're cruxing on side characters and ultimately trying to do much more of a story that is otherwise tied to other people rather than seemingly what I would assume would have been the main character, which would have been Phil's character this entire time. But when looking at it, they also kind of make fun of that fact that Phil is probably the most important character, hence why they they shift the story the way it does. Really, man, really, the second half, I think we have it to where reasonably I like the absurdity that kind of goes along with this show. I like the fact that we are really tying an entire episode on silly concepts or stuff like that, or just little childish things that ultimately, when really watching this show, like I feel like a lot of things going on in this show are very childish, but I think it's childish in a good way, it's childish in a funny way, and it's childish in just the overall approach of this show, which I thought was really fun. It would be honestly interesting to have seen like a younger uh, cast of this kind of approach this, but when looking at it, uh, that I feel has kind of a lot of times has been done already, so you could have kind of just gotten anyone. So going into this second half, there is one moment that I thought was utterly hilarious, and I think is like the best moment of this season. But when kind of looking at it, like there are some things here and there that ultimately people could debate, like, oh no, this is the funniest part of this season, or oh no, this is the this like probably the opening of this season ultimately was really really funny. Something as simple as Phil just driving around through every building and every place known to man to ultimately say, hello? Is there anybody alive? Hello? Bonjour? Chinese hello? And so on and so forth. So, going on into this show, immediately I thought that, like, well, no matter what, it's still hilarious. I think it's still funny. And when looking at it, it's a very simplistic show in its approach because reasonably anything. It doesn't have one long stretch of mission that is going to take forever like a normal like Walking Dead show would go into, where like you have in episode 1 where you have villain, and the entire season we have it to where Rick is fighting so and so villain from The Walking Dead, and then eventually at the very last episode they beat said villain and win the day, and they're like, "Yay, whoop de doo, yay for us!" Like this show doesn't go into that. It doesn't have like really a long shelf life of story, which is great. It can kind of be whatever it needs to be, and I think that that is the best part about this show. Is it really just really crux is on the fact that it doesn't have to fit some kind of like story. It can just be whatever it wants. When when going man, my voice is crackling like I'm hitting that puberty. So But yeah, going into this show, I immediately thought that Phil was an interesting character, and ultimately, I was thinking, I'm like, well, is this season going to end up killing somebody off? Or are we going to end up? Because it kind of feels like that way in some portions where it's just like, okay, how is this person going to be alive at some point in time? And like throughout, how is everyone going to survive when eventually they're probably going to run out of resources, considering the people that they probably keep adding and adding and adding? And we have it to where people, most of the people who are left are, for the most point, uh, pity pity pretty much like not the brightest bulbs in the in the box, let's just say. So let's go into and let's ultimately break down this season and call this a day, and then ultimately get on to other episodes or other videos and stuff along those lines. So let's crack into that double five to otherwise go into this and ultimately say that, yeah, still really enjoying the show, even though reasonably, like, it feels like the episodes or the show is at kind of like a smaller scale of things, for the most point, because it kind of feels like people are just kind of like, it does also feel like the shows are really just improvised. Like, it doesn't feel like there is a big overall plan for every episode. It just kind of feels like, hey, how about we just do this today? Nah, all right. And so they end up winging an entire episode just based on like somebody's gut feeling, or ultimately just wild ideas. Uh, and then ultimately we have it to where I'm sure a lot of times we have it to where Will or any number of actor is ultimately just like, you know what, like, how about I just say this today, just to kind of get somebody to laugh, or ultimately see if anybody breaks during this episode. So going into here, let's ultimately go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this show. So we have it to where ultimately in this second half. So we end up having it to where reasonably it seems that Will is almost on his way to be separated from this entire group. We ultimately have it to where reasonably Phil is with Carol, Melissa, and Todd, and so we end up having it to where Phil ultimately is starting to really put a wrench into the people that he lives with, to where Carol is consistently bringing up the door of which that he uh, Carol is bringing up the door that Phil didn't exactly put together all that well, and we have it to where reasonably Phil is otherwise going to a bar even more often to separate himself from everyone else, and we basically have it to where like Phil is kind of annoyed by the fact that it seems that everybody has a grievance with him and he's the president of the United States. And so we eventually have it where Phil ultimately goes and eventually wants to win people over. And so the way of which to win people over is with a cow. So ultimately we have it where Phil brings a cow into people's lives and they are just ecstatic. They're like, oh my God, we have a cow. We can make cereal. We can make ice cream. We can make this. We can make that. And so everyone is really, really excited. And so, but the whole thing of it is we have it to where Phil ultimately is to seemingly have Todd do most of the cow work, because evidently, like, Todd basically is written in to be a character that knows seemingly everything about everything, or knows how to do everything about everything. And so we end up having it to where Phil and Todd are ultimately just driving a wedge into one another, because Phil is just overly annoyed that Todd knows how to do everything and he's so much better at everything than Phil is. And because we end up having it to where Todd ends up like tying the cow onto some tree and stuff like that to eventually uh, we have it to where Phil, in utter jealousy, goes and unties the cow from this tree to ultimately have him taken away, hiding him somewhere. And we eventually have it to where the next day that ultimately everybody's looking for motives to see who would have stolen the cow. We end up having it to where Melissa goes right away and assumes that, oh, well, probably Phil took the cow. Like, I'm sure it's probably at his bar somewhere. Where is the bar, Phil, that ultimately you would go to? And so we end up having it to where they are ultimately going and scrambling to ultimately find this cow because ultimately they need their ice cream, they need their milk, they need their whatever. And so we have it to where ultimately Phil goes into desperation mode into trying to drive as quickly as humanly possible to the bar to ultimately find said cow. And eventually we have it to where Todd ends up finding the cow, but ultimately doesn't want to take any of the credit for finding the cow. And so ultimately Todd gives the credit of finding the cow to Phil. Ultimately, we have it to where Phil is ultimately like, yeah, I found the cow. Look at me. I found the cow. Look at me. I did it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of thing. And so ultimately, we have it to where everyone is ultimately just saying like, well, yeah, you found the cow because you had to find the cow because otherwise we would have found out that you would have taken the cow from us and so on and so forth. So we eventually had them like put a fence around the cow, but eventually they get it to where Carol ends up taking the cow into her own room, so that way Phil has to forcibly sleep with Carol in her home. So we eventually have it to where things are coming to a head, and ultimately we have it to where reasonably Melissa, Carol, and Todd are starting to see lies just starting to pile up from Phil. And ultimately, we have it to where this is finally coming to a head. To where ultimately, they do not want to talk to Phil anymore. And so we ultimately have it to where Phil is like, oh, you guys aren't talking to me, huh? Because what ends up happening is that Phil ends up going off on his own to realize that he's like, you know what? I don't need these people. Like, I can go on my own. And so ultimately, he goes off onto his own and bumps into Gail and Erica. And so he ends up basically deciding to go with Gail and Erica off on their own to ultimately have him mention that, like, oh, yeah, like, there are no other survivors but me. And ultimately we have it to where Gail and Erica mention to Phil that ultimately like, hey, you're wearing a wedding ring. And we have it to where Phil ultimately makes up a story about Carol being dead, and that ultimately we have it to where he has to mention like the sleep apnea machine that she had and everything like that. And so that way Phil could ultimately win some points with Erica and Gail. So we end up seemingly having it to where Erica and Gail are ultimately trying to win Phil over with all kinds of things, so that way ultimately they could seduce him at some point. But eventually, Phil basically uh, goes to dinner with them and ultimately humiliates them, talking some things about Erica's race and ultimately um, uh, talking about Gail's age. So we end up having it to where Erica and Gail are ultimately just like, yeah, like this guy's a bit of a jerk. And so we have it to where otherwise Gail and Erica end up driving with Phil around into the road and stuff along those lines to eventually bump into Melissa, Todd, and Carol. And so we end up having it to where Phil ends up hiding into the back seat, hoping that ultimately they would never go back into the back seat. And so we end up having it to where these all group of people all meet together, and so they end up opening this door for eventually Carol to mention to Phil, like, "Oh my God, that's my husband," and we end up having Erica and Gail ultimately saying, like, "Well, I thought your Carol was dead," and ultimately Phil chimes in to ultimately say, like, "Well, hey, that was another Carol. Like, I had married another girl named Carol before I had met this Carol," and so, like, lying out of his mouth. So we end up having it to where Erica and Gail otherwise can never forgive Phil for basically not having them be tied to otherwise these other people because they thought that they were the only survivors left. So we end up having it to where Phil is ultimately exiled seemingly from these people by silence. Ultimately, we have Phil go into the fray to ultimately go in and notice that no one is talking to him. Everyone is giving him the silent treatment. So he's like, "Oh, you guys are playing the silent treatment? Well, I can play that game too." And so ultimately, we have to where Phil gets right up in their face and he's like, It's like, like he's like, He's even going and looking at the cow and he's like, and the cow like looks away from him. And he's like, boom, silent treatment. And then he just goes off, which I think is the most hilarious scene in this entire season is the boom silent treatment moment in the show, which I think is freaking hilarious. So we end up having it to where ultimately Phil eventually is getting secluded away from this show or away from these people, and eventually we have it to where Phil is to ultimately start to realize that maybe he should count his blessings, kind of thing. And so ultimately we have it to where Phil ends up going off and readjusting every single one of these signs. Because it seems more and more that the more people know that there's alive in Tucson, that ultimately everyone is going to go to Tucson, and ultimately Phil will ultimately just look like a laughing stock at some point. He'll be the town pariah or whatever, when ultimately there are more and more people added. So we end up having it to where Phil ends up adjusting these signs to ultimately say move to Tampa, and ultimately we end up finding out the ladder that ultimately Phil was to get to up to this sign from had fallen down, and so we have to where Phil is ultimately like assessing whether or not he's going to jump off of this sign or not, and so we end up having it to where Phil is going to try to jump, but then ultimately just decides not to, and so on and so forth, to the point to where eventually we have it to where Phil ultimately is to lay out into this sign to try to find some form of shade, and ultimately he ends up taking his pants off just to figure out how to make shade, and then eventually his pants blow away and he's like, "Oh, that was my shade." So we end up having it to where Phil is ending up like outstretching his shirt to try to make himself get some kind of aspect of shade and so on and so forth to just be able to block the sun somehow. So we end up having it to where eventually Carol and all the rest of the people end up realizing that it's like, you know what? Phil has been gone for a very long time, because we have it to where ultimately uh, Phil and Carol end up going and having a divorce. They end up realizing that, like, you know what, like, this really is not working, and so ultimately they end up going and having a divorce. We have it to where Phil is going to end up with any number of women that ultimately are kind of deciding to be with Phil at some point. We end up having it to where Phil is having a date with two women, but ultimately we end up having it to where Phil realizes that, well, I'm gonna try to get no one else to come to Tucson. So we end up having it to where Phil ends up getting stuck upon this sign, and ultimately there was two women ultimately waiting for his date, and so we end up having it to where there is someone that ends up rescuing Phil. So we end up finding that there seemingly is another man that is ultimately named Phil, and this man ultimately has the exact same name as Phil. So if anything, we have it to where Phil Stacy Miller ultimately is Boris Kajo. And so we ultimately have it to where this big muscular man is making his way to this environment and to Tucson to ultimately meet and greet all of these other women. And so we have it to where Phil and Todd are otherwise just hating on this other Phil because of how muscular he is and how good looking he is and everything like that. We end up having Todd that is just like, oh my god, he's going to go after my woman now. Like, he's going to go after my Melissa. And I just can't have that happen. So we end up having Phil ending up fixing a lot of things that neither one of Todd and or the other Phil could fix. And eventually we get to the point where ultimately everybody's like, well, how about, considering there is two Phils and that could get really confusing, how about we call the first Phil, the Phil, we call him, like, not Phil 2, we end up calling him by his middle name, which ultimately Phil ends up saying that his middle name is Tandy, which is the weirdest middle name to have. That ultimately now everyone is going to call him Tandy or Tandy Man, which I thought was hilarious. So we end up having it to where now, from Phil to now Tandy, because ultimately to ridicule that basically Phil is basically a laughing stock, and that's all he is. He's the town pariah at some points. We end up having Phil, and I thought it was also hilarious that Phil was trying to regain access into the group by ultimately mentioning that he had a twin brother called Mark Miller, and I thought that that scene was hilarious too, where we end up having Phil portray Mark Miller, and ultimately we have to where Mark Miller ends up knocking on the door. They end up opening the door. It's like, yeah, hey, like, I'm Mark Miller, and ultimately, like I have a twin brother who's named Phil. You hadn't happened to seen him, have you? Like, oh, there's people here, and ultimately they close the door on Phil, knowing full well it's Phil, ultimately portraying some twin brother. And then we ultimately have it to where all the people are making jokes about ultimately, like, are you Mark or are you Phil? They should have just called him Mark from the get go then, to make a joke that ultimately, like, yeah, you're Mark now. So, because ultimately we had it to where Phil ends up, like, changing his hair to a perm, and then ultimately, like, that was a consistent joke for a while. So, going back, we have it to where now. We have it to where Phil and now Tandy are ultimately starting to we have it to where Phil is to ultimately start putting together, not Tandy. Phil ends up putting together some like survival stuff for people to relive their life again. Phil is talking about solar power stuff, so that way they can have electricity. He is talking about rigging a shower for everyone to have showers again, and ultimately we have it to where Todd and Phil are ultimately really angry and upset about Phil, or Phil or Todd and Tandy are upset with Phil because reasonably we have it to where like this guy ultimately is consistently while working is consistently taking his shirt off and consistently showing his muscles to all the women. We have it to where eventually Todd ends up showing Tandy that he had put a shower together, and so Phil ends up going and starting to undress to go into the shower, and we have it to where Tandy is watching him like take off his shirt and everything like that, and we end up having Phil consistently mention to Tandy, it's like, "Hey, I'm taking a shower," and Tandy's like, "Yeah, huh?" And Phil's like, "You want to leave?" And Tandy's like, "Uh huh." Like, just to kind of see like what they can get away with on the show to also just ultimately kind of stretch this joke a little bit long. But ultimately Tandy leaves and then Phil gets into the shower. So we have it to where all the women all go in and start using their showers, and Todd assumes that all the women had had sex with Phil, and so ultimately Todd is running off to Tandy to ultimately say, "Hey, yeah, Phil had had sex with all the women. How could he?" And so we end up having it to where Tandy ends up going in and speaking to Carol, and it seems like she is uh, very well pleased and very well in a robe and everything like that, and we have it to where Tandy's assuming that Carol had slept with Phil. But ultimately, Carol has mentioned, no, like, I didn't sleep with Phil, I just went into the shower. And so we have it to where every single woman ultimately is coming out with a shot, with a robe on to ultimately say that they had taken a shower. And so we end up having Tandy go to Todd and ultimately mention, like, oh no, they didn't all have sex. They all just went and had a shower, and ultimately Todd was like, "Oh, thank God." We end up having it to where Todd is trying to cement a relationship with Melissa, and he ultimately tells her that he loves her, and Melissa ends up saying thank you. Because ultimately, at some point, we end up having Todd, who ultimately wants to go on his own, and we end up having it to where Todd, or to where Tandy, not Todd, Tandy ends up confessing all this stuff to all of the people, like wanting to divorce Carol, wanting to tell Melissa that ultimately he loved her, or that he like really thought that she was attractive, and so on and so forth, and ultimately confessing to Todd that ultimately he had uh, wanted to leave him off to the side of the road, and ultimately, I believe that Tandy had confessed to Carol and Gail about his life and stuff like that. So, if anything, because ultimately, when he was given the silent treatment, that's when we had Todd confess to everybody about what he really and truly wanted, and hence why Carol and Tandy had gotten a divorce, to ultimately lead it to where, eventually, to where since Carol ultimately is not having a marriage with Tandy, we end up having it to where Phil ends up sneaking into Carol's bedroom, kind of thing. And we end up having it to where Carol ultimately goes and ultimately sleeps with Phil. Ultimately, to the point of Tandy ultimately having and feeling that he is like betrayed by Carol, or ultimately like in some kind of weird form or fashion. We ultimately have it to where Tandy is definitely teaming up with Todd to want to get rid of Phil somehow, and ultimately they need to figure out how to do all this. So we end up having it to where, because basically what ends up happening is uh, Phil ends up sleeping with Carol, and so we have it to where eventually that there is a dissension into the ranks, Because ultimately we have it to where uh, Tandy is ultimately talking about the grievance board and how a lot of things have been crossed off lately, with the exception of a lot of problems being with Phil, or being with Tandy. I mean, and so we end up having it to where Phil is ultimately in this meeting, and so we have it to where Phil is now really and truly otherwise just annoyed with Tandy, and he's ultimately just saying that he's like, well, why is it that you're president? Like, if anything, the like no one should be like, you definitely should not be president. And ultimately we have it to where Tandy's like, well, who do you think should be president? And ultimately Phil is like, well, I think I should be. And so we end up having it to where there's ascension into the ranks, and ultimately they end up wanting to go ahead and banish Phil from this group. That's what Phil wants to do, is to banish Tandy from this group, because it seems that ultimately everyone has started to like come to the consensus. It's like, well, Tandy is a real pathological liar, and ultimately everything that he says is a lie, and ultimately we have Phil having to remember all the lies that he's ever said, and so we have it to a reasonably Tandy is to be taken by Phil and driven far, far away to probably Phil's special spot, to ultimately have it to where Phil gives Tandy all these supplies and just says, like, "Meh, sucks to be you," kind of thing. We ultimately have it to where Tandy is without car, he is just with supplies, and that's it. And we ultimately have it to where Phil tells Tandy that it's like, you can never come back again. Don't ever try to come back to Tucson. And so we end up having it to where Phil ends up driving off, and then eventually we get it to where, there's also one moment where I think it was interesting to where Phil was just eating toilet paper, even though he probably had actual food to eat. He was just eating toilet paper in one scene where ultimately he was just left alone to be with his own devices, to talk to all of his balls. So we end up having it to where Phil is left with the most skimmest or fewest supplies possible, and so eventually we have seemingly another car drive up, and ultimately this car ends up being Carol. And so we end up having it to where Tandy ends up talking to Carol and is like, well, hey, like, why is it that you're here? Ultimately, aren't you going to go ahead and sleep with Phil more and this and that? And ultimately, we have it to where even though they're divorced, it seems like Carol still has feelings for Tandy. And ultimately, like, I think Carol likes the freedom that Tandy gives her, where ultimately, if Carol was with Phil, ultimately it seems like there would be a lack thereof of freedom, and so ultimately we would probably have quite possibly people ending up just wanting to separate themselves away from the secondary Phil to go back and be a part of this idiocracy of, instead of democracy, idiocracy that ultimately is provided with Phil, and so on and so forth. Like, I'm kind of expecting that Todd is going to eventually make his way back to find Phil, or Tandy in this case, and because ultimately we're probably going to have Melissa, who ends up probably with Phil at some point, just because story will probably tell you that. Because I'm assessing that reasonably, if Melissa is not wanting to really legitimately say that she loves Todd, even though reasonably we have it to where Melissa kind of says it, and to where Todd is ultimately saying, like, well, you did say that you loved me, but you didn't, like, actually say it. Melissa's like, come on, like, give me something at least. And so we end up having it to where reasonably Carol is ultimately telling Tandy that it's like, well, hey, how about we separate ourselves from the group and then just kind of go anywhere? Like that's basically the thing about this environment, that no one has to absolutely be in Tucson. It's like people can just go anywhere. If anything, they could be living the high life in Hollywood Boulevard, or some kind of other like really interesting place that ultimately is very interesting to look at, like New York City or something like that. Like, why aren't they at Las Vegas right now, just throwing, rolling dice anywhere? That's what I would. That's what I would expect for this show to ultimately go into having there be ultimately just adventures and stuff along those lines. So recently there was a lot of stuff that I tended to skip about or skip around about within this review, but when also looking at it, like I wanted to try to get this done as quickly as humanly as possible. Because normally I just spent like an hour and 20 minutes on Willy Wonderland. So Willy's Wonderland, ultimately the Nicolas Cage film that ultimately I guess a lot of people wanted to see the review for that, and I was utterly grateful because ultimately I'm like, yeah, I hope everybody wants to see this review because I actually liked this movie and I actually enjoyed that film. Kind of showcasing exactly when this video comes out, but whatever. Um, when looking at it, I love that film. It was really fun. So, anyways, speaking of fun, it's your birthday, and it's time to get along. So I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.